Minerva presents. Hello, fellow readers, and welcome to our bookish oasis. Today, we embark on a transformative journey through the thought-provoking pages of the years by Annie Ernaux. If my videos bring a smile to your face or provide valuable insights, show some love by liking and following my channel. And if you want to take it a step further, leave a comment sharing your favorite part or any suggestions you may have. Pages 148. Annie Ernaux writes in a free flow of prose from a collectively conscious perspective, using the pronouns we and they, as well as, occasionally, her or she when speaking about one specific woman who remains unnamed in the book. She begins the years with a lamentation for all of the images that will disappear. She does not explain this term. In short, bullet points, she lists image after image that will be lost, such as an old TV ad, people one sees on the street, movie stills ingrained in the mind, etc., before proceeding to list the words which will disappear too. Here, she lists turns of phrase that remind one of parents or grandparents, jargon from school days, and more. She then describes a photo of a baby, presumably the focus of the book, born during World War I. Ernaux launches from here into an account of war times and the liberation as overheard by young children surrounded by older family members and friends. She writes that parents sat at tables reminiscing about the liberation, comparing the two world wars, and singing nostalgic songs while the children sat separately, impatient to go play. Then, Ernaux describes the resilient actions of the adults of that era, their working-class mannerisms and habits, which demonstrated that they felt as though one were forever obliged to bridle against the universe 27. Unlike these adults, Ernaux writes, their children did not have to miss school to work the field. Rather, they pursued their education, longing to be grown up, remembering tiny but significant moments in each school day. New appliances and material goods became commercially available, heightening the longing of the young generation for a different life than that of their ancestors in the provincial regions of France. Yet, their lives were still humble. We lived in proximity to shit, she explains, of the hygienic limitations. Furthermore, Ernaux says, there were dead children in every family. 35. She describes the photograph of a small, smiling girl who she says is the older sister of the girl in the first photo. From there, Ernaux discusses the growth of that young generation of boys and girls, constantly kept apart but instinctively drawn to each other through the knowledge of a future illicit relationship between the sexes. The post-war era was in full swing, with more goods being produced all the time, though religion, Catholicism, retained a stronghold in the smaller communities over the burgeoning materialism in France. This materialism and rise of advertising led to young girls learning to distinguish between themselves according to a secret moral divide, with clothing play a role in a girl's image and morality. At school, Ernaux writes, class divisions became apparent while sex lingered at the forefront of the pubescent students' minds. Knowing it to be some clandestine act reserved only for married couples, young people explored their desires through secret trips to watch burlesque shows and movies. Young people masturbated widely, but in secret, as the church and parental lessons made the practice appear taboo. Years passed, and by the time the boys had to go away for military service, a definite sense of gender differences colored their departure with heroism and gallantry. Sexual maturity appeared to be on the horizon for the young generation that had been born during France's occupation. Pages 49, 88. The second section of the years opens with the description of a photo of two girls, one of them the same girl mentioned in descriptions of previous photographs, the other, her sister, standing on school grounds. As a teenager, the first girl yearned for a record player and read widely, bored by her family's dinner conversations and daydreaming all the time. Discussions of the war had entered the realm of private misfortune, 56, and were no longer mentioned at the table. The kind of music the youth listened to was increasingly in English, thus separating them from the world of their parents all at once. Boys and girls, meanwhile, struggled to interact casually, secretly afraid of one another. Then, Ernaux writes, all of a sudden, the girl in the photographs is aware of her social standing, 61. She realized that her family lacked material possessions others had, and that their bathroom was pitifully held outdoors instead of indoors. She looked forward only to writing the back, an important school examination, which she felt would launch her into an adulthood at once, both remote and within reach. She imagined her entire appearance maturing beautifully once the backs is over with. She heard vaguely of world events and fighting in Algeria between the French and the Algerians, but none of her thoughts on this and other political subjects appeared in her personal diary. The summer after the first back saw the merging, still hesitant, of the local group of boys and the local group of girls, writes Ernaux, and shame lay in wait at every turn. 68. As sexual desires were haltingly, awkwardly explored by girls who heard their mothers' voices in the back of their heads saying, "If you have sex before marriage, no one will want you." 68. Ernaux continues with a more precise rundown of historical events which passed by the young generation as though they were not happening in the same world as their daily worries. People were accustomed to violence and separation in the world. East-West, Khrushchev, the Music Kennedy, the leading man, Peponi Don Camillo, Jekwes, Luminite Kek, Luminite Allura, France Tito, Cathos Commies. Meanwhile, we studied for our second back, 75s, she writes. Reproductive health was of grave concern at this point, but contraceptive still taboo and sexual activity always clandestine. The young people read modern books but did not disclose their ideas to their professors as Simone de Beauvoir and Freud were too controversial. The university students visited home every so often, happy to have their laundry done and decent cooking once more outside of the resident halls they lived in during their studies. Yet, they suddenly felt that home was a foreign place, their parents' eating habits intolerable, their stories outdated, and the students longed to return to a bygone era of pleasant and simple Sundays with their families when these thoughts did not intrude. Towards the end of this section, Ernaux writes of the girl whose consciousness this book follows indirectly, stating that at the time, yet another photograph of her was taken with a series of classmates. She did not feel at home with her wealthier friends. She felt her philosophical ideas were too old for her own youth. Meanwhile, new material goods preoccupied the minds of young couples, and the girl herself became aware that the social superiority of couples over singles, 87, necessitated quick falling. She got married and finished school working as a teacher, scarcely aware of the outside world and its historical perpetuity, as she turned suddenly inward to her domestic unit. Pages 89, 140. Ernaux states that young parenthood for a woman in particular suddenly threw that individual into disbelief about her own circumstances. Her past worries and her student days seemed so far gone, as if they had been associated with another person entirely. Visits from in-laws, induced feelings of pride and adulthood, even as they reminded one that one's life had become entirely shared and was not one's own any longer. She writes that the sense of unreality was pervasive. We were amazed to be where we were and to have all that we desires: a man, a child, an apartment, 91. In a photograph described by Ernaux, a young woman in the winter of 1967-1968 sits with her toddler son, fully absorbed in the family unit. Her concerns are now only about sustenance and hygiene, and she feels she has deviated from her former goals. 93. Then, May 1968 resulted in an eruption of political turmoil as students and workers protested around the country. Ernaux describes the young generation of which the new mother was a part as having caught the bug, 96, of disquietude. Through the fighting between protesters and police, Ernaux writes that the young mother is reminded of the 1936 described by her parents so many years earlier. The Communist Party, which gained traction during this time, lacked a solid direction or leadership, but the protesters held their faith in its ideals against the previous status quo. And yet, the party too crumbled soon after and lost the appeal it had held in May. Protesters realized that political questions could not be answered easily after all, and we forgave ourselves nothing. 100, writes Ernaux, of the violence and mistakes made by either side. Meanwhile, identity politics began to proliferate in France. Individuals, writes the author, whether or not they were intellectuals, were entitled to speak and be heard. They needed only represent a group, a condition, an injustice. 101. New values seemed to appear overnight, with the concept of shame becoming obsolete through a liberation of sexuality, voice, and spirituality. Voice and spirituality. The liberal young people of France embraced new fads, acknowledging that theirs was a consumer society now. The woman mentioned frequently in the photographs described throughout the book has begun, according to Ernaux, to imagine herself outside of her marriage and family life by the time this change in society takes place. Next to her inner turmoil regarding her future, political events seemed insignificant and thus are not remembered except as headlines on TV. May 1968 had failed. The woman in the photographs moved with her family to a new city in the Paris region, immersing herself in the new suburban landscape and feeling increasingly out of touch with the woman, herself, whose older photographs she sometimes looks at. During family visits with her parents, conversation inevitably focused itself on the present, as memories of the war faded and the time of children replaced the time of the dead. 128. In the 1980s, in her 40s, the woman in the photographs felt herself to be weary and half-mad. Ernaux describes a photograph of the woman, one of her sons, and her husband, finding that the photograph captures the remoteness of the woman's thoughts at that time. Divorcing her husband soon after, the process of dividing up their material possessions assured the woman that something final was taking place. Then, a liberal turn in the national government made people of her generation find something, at last, to hope for. Once more, however, the peace didn't last. 137. And economic troubles soon began when market economics took center stage. Pages 141, 190. Ernaux continues her memoir by describing the rise of right-wing political backlash in response to the development of banlieues, neighborhoods in which poor immigrants lived, with many of them being of specifically North African Arab descent. She writes that the new young generation, coming of age in this climate, expressed outrage at the racism they saw in French politics. Meanwhile, The Catholic religion had ceased to be a significant influence in the lives of most French people, and boys and girls entered into adulthood fully used to coexisting with one another, unlike in the past. She describes a video in which the woman previously photographed is shown speaking to her students, for she is a teacher. She feels she is getting older and fears losing her ability to be a free sexual being. She now has a lover and pampers her sons when they visit home from university, but is otherwise leading a solitary life. Then, Ernaux writes, the re-election of Mitterrand took place and reassured the generation of the woman in the photographs, who feared the election of the right wing but were not confident that the left would always be elected. 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall appeared to open up an entirely new era, though the emptiness of this idea in reality disillusioned many in France. The advance of women's rights put women at the center of many debates, but consumerism simultaneously encouraged a rise in products targeting women in order to make them feel that their beauty required supplements and complements. Ernaux describes all of these developments one after the other, blending politics, ideology, and criticism. Ernaux continues with the description of a photograph of the same woman, only know quite deep into the middle-age period of her life. She lives alone with a cat and is concerned with how her thoughts now tend to roam towards the past rather than the present or future. She would like to write down all the disparate images of herself in her mind and put them together in a memoir. But she cannot decide between using the word I or the word she. Neither perspective seems like the right one from which to begin writing. Along with growing physically older, Ernaux says that the woman's generation was also experiencing challenges, embracing new technology and new politicians. Chirac appeared as a viable political candidate in France, and the woman's children's generation appeared to value him highly. Family dinner conversations with the partners of one's children became an experience of learning as well as tradition, and the middle-aged felt increasingly happy to allow their offspring to lord over the conversation, directing the future. The election of Chirac was a further new thing to get used to, but was not life-changing or earth-shattering for most. Ernaux writes that thanks to the speed at which the world moved through new trends, technologies, and ideologies, older people were made to feel as though they did not age. Instead, products aged and people simply adapted to them one after the other. Pages 191, 231. Ernaux describes the photograph of a woman wearing blush with several young people who are her sons and their partners. The group is visiting Trouville in 1999, and the woman imagines her own mother would be so surprised to see how the boys have grown. She thinks that her nurturing role is limiting, and she still craves sexual intimacy. Now, she is seeing a much younger man who makes her feel she is reliving her own student days. Her confusion at the passing of time and the seemingly unrelated fragments of events and memories encourages her to want to record everything in her book. Then, the year 2000 arrived and passed. People felt everything leading up to the moment was their last chance or last opportunity. Yet, the event itself proved unworthy of the apocalyptic atmosphere preceding it. The events of September 11, 2011, however, attracted everyone's attention. We berated ourselves, writes Ernaux, for having believed the U.S. Invincible, 199. The fear which immediately followed the event and pervaded the entire world brought people together. People realized the Muslims could no longer be forgotten, 202, and Frenchmen and women reacted harshly, with fear and condemnation, to the sudden prominence of a religion that was not their own. Next, political crisis at home in France revived the French desire for democracy. The left had been eliminated in a recent election, and people felt discouraged not only by this loss, but also by the loss of the Blues, the French national team, in the World Cup. Recovering from these devastations, French people turned to the stores around them, increasingly catering even to the poorest consumers in the country. Ernaux describes the feeling as such. Now we knew that all we had didn't add up to happiness, but that was no reason to abandon things. 200 nan. All of this meant that with all the intermingling of concepts, it was increasingly difficult to find a phrase of one's own, the kind that, when silently repeated, helped one live 211. In another photograph, the now middle-aged woman mentioned so often before sits with her arms wrapped around a little girl, her granddaughter. She feels no different than women of 40, 5 or 50, and almost gets the sense that, internally, she has stopped aging for now. She has not stopped living, and indeed several important events have occurred to her over the past few years. Her younger, former lover got a new partner, arousing intense jealousy and sadness in her. Her beloved cat passed away after 16 years of companionship. She met a new lover, and she discovered she had a tumor growing in her breast and underwent chemotherapy. Increasingly, the woman dwells on her book, the memoir she is intent on writing. It will not be a work of remembrance in the usual sense, aimed at putting a life into a story, creating an explanation of self 228. Instead, it will be a slippery narrative composed in an unremitting continuous tense 229. Ernaux implicitly reveals, therefore, that she is the woman in all of the aforementioned photographs, and that it is this, her memoir, which the woman in the photographs dreams of writing.